The ICU Haunting, a nurse's horror story from the COVID-19 lockdown. Tell late night story. Welcome to DTC, the place of the brave. As an Emily nurse, I deeply relate to the story I'm about to share. The pandemic wasn't just a health crisis, it was a nightmare for those of us on the front lines, especially in the Emily. We witnessed the worst. Patients with mild symptoms were sent to other wards, but those admitted to the Emily were already at death's door. In other departments, healthcare workers saw recoveries, celebrated discharges, and watched families reunite. But in the Emily, our role often wasn't to save, it was to say goodbye. More often than not, we weren't sending people home, we were tagging and bagging. Take a moment to listen to this story and try to put yourself in our shoes. Thank you for your time, and I hope this experience gives you something to reflect on. I wish that back then, our country had been able to come together as one to face the pandemic. Looking back at 2020, when the virus first started to spread, I remember how the world had been warned by the Chinese government as early as December 2019. At that time, China had already begun strict lockdowns, while here in America, people were more concerned about their personal freedoms than the looming crisis ahead. Some even made memes about COVID-19, spreading jokes and misinformation across social media, as if the virus were nothing more than a fleeting internet trend. But by March 2020, reality hit. America officially shut down. I'm Emily, an ICU nurse working the night shift from 7 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. Before the pandemic, my daily routine included battling rush hour traffic on my way to and from work, surrounded by a sea of cars, honking horns, and impatient commuters. But when the lockdown went into effect, the world changed overnight. The once busy streets became eerily silent. Even the highways, usually packed with vehicles, were nearly empty. It felt surreal, like stepping into the opening scene of a post-apocalyptic zombie movie. My friends working in the emergency department, ED, and other hospital wards noticed a strange shift. Things actually slowed down. People were afraid to come to the hospital, fearing exposure to the virus. Routine visits dropped. The waiting rooms, once filled with patients, became ghost towns. But inside the ICU, it was a different story. My unit, once reserved for the most critical patients, quickly became overwhelmed. Bed after bed was filled with people struggling to breathe, their oxygen levels plummeting. Many arrived gasping for air, their lungs failing them, requiring immediate intubation and mechanical ventilation. It felt like an endless flood of suffering. At first, we tried to keep up, convincing ourselves that it was just a temporary surge. But soon we realized that this was only the beginning. Every shift blurred into the next, and the weight of what we were witnessing grew heavier. Patients came in, but very few left alive. Families called, desperate for updates, but hospital protocols meant they couldn't visit their loved ones. We became their only connection to the outside world, holding up phones so they could hear the voices of their children, their spouses, their parents, often for the last time. The hardest part? The helplessness. As nurses, we're trained to heal, to save lives. But during those early days, it felt like we were constantly losing. We weren't just fighting the virus, we were fighting time, fighting a broken system, fighting the fear that had gripped the world. Those long nights in the ICU felt endless, but the truth was, we didn't have time to process what was happening. We pushed forward because we had no other choice. Because behind every bed, behind every ventilator, behind every exhausted breath, was a person who needed us. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if we had come together sooner, if we had listened, if we had taken it seriously from the start. Could things have been different? In those first chaotic weeks of the pandemic, testing for the virus was wildly inconsistent. We had patients exhibiting every textbook symptom of COVID-19, yet their tests still came back negative. The uncertainty made everything harder. Protocols were strict. If a patient wasn't officially diagnosed with COVID-19, we were only allowed to wear standard surgical masks while caring for them. But for confirmed cases, we had to wear N95 respirators. The problem was, we often didn't know for sure who had it and who didn't. One night, during one of my grueling 12-hour shifts, a patient was transferred to the ICU from the emergency department. His name was Pastor James, a 68-year-old man who had likely spent his final healthy days praying for others, comforting his congregation, and unknowingly exposing himself to the virus. By the time he arrived, he was already in critical condition. His heart rate had dropped to 30 beats per minute, a dangerously low level. I knew what was coming. His oxygen saturation was undetectable, which meant that his organs were already shutting down. As soon as we wheeled him into the ICU and transferred him onto a fresh hospital bed, his heart stopped. My colleague David, a 32-year-old ICU nurse, didn't hesitate for a second. He immediately jumped onto the bed and began performing chest compressions, pressing down hard and fast, trying to bring Pastor James back. But there was a problem. David was only wearing a surgical mask. At that moment, we still didn't know for sure whether the patient had COVID-19. The safe thing to do would have been to step back, put on full protective gear, and then begin resuscitation. But David didn't wait. He made a choice, the kind of choice that nurses on the front lines had to make every single day during those early months. He put his own health on the line to give this man a fighting chance. For 15 agonizing minutes, we fought to bring him back. Each time I checked for a pulse, there was nothing. Each time we pushed another round of epinephrine, I prayed for a flicker of life. Then, finally, his heart started beating again. That night, I was assigned as his primary nurse. He was still in critical condition, barely clinging to life. I knew I couldn't let my guard down, not even for a second. Throughout the shift, Pastor James coded multiple times. His heart kept stopping, and each time I was there, administering life-saving drugs, adjusting his medications, and monitoring every tiny change in his vitals. I stood by his bedside the entire night, barely daring to blink, terrified that the moment I looked away, he would slip away for good. Every time I pushed a dose of epinephrine, his heart would respond, but only just enough to keep him alive. It was a brutal cycle of hope and despair. We were exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. Cases like his were becoming more and more common, and with each passing day, we were losing more patients than we were saving. We were doing everything we could, but it felt like we were fighting a storm that refused to calm. Looking back, I wonder if David got sick after that night. I never asked. Maybe I was afraid of the answer. What I do know is that he, like so many of us, didn't hesitate when a life was on the line. That's what it meant to be an ICU nurse during the early days of the pandemic. We weren't just caregivers. We were soldiers in an invisible war, fighting for every breath, every heartbeat, every chance at survival. The night after Pastor James's battle in the ICU, I returned for another shift, mentally preparing myself for another grueling 12 hours. The air in the hospital was thick with exhaustion, stress, and something else, something unspoken. The weight of the past few nights lingered like a shadow over all of us. That night, David was assigned as the float nurse, meaning he didn't have his own patients but was there to assist wherever he was needed. It was a crucial role, especially since many of us were stretched too thin. Meanwhile, my patient, Pastor James, had been placed on a ventilator and had stabilized, at least for now, but his heart rate remained dangerously unpredictable. Every so often, his vitals would dip, and each time I would have to rush into the room, shake him gently, administer medication, and bring him back from the brink once again. Outside the room, my colleagues stood ready to assist if necessary, but with the severe shortage of masks, gowns, and face shields, we had to be strategic. If I could handle it alone, I would. We had to conserve our protective gear because none of us knew how long this fight would last. Then came 2 a.m. By that point, exhaustion was settling deep in my bones. David, being the amazing teammate he was, insisted I take a break. "Go rest for 30 minutes, he said. "I'll cover for you." Grateful, I stepped out of the ICU and into the break room. I took off my gloves, sanitized my hands, and sank into a chair. It wasn't much, but even a short break felt like a gift during those long nights. I closed my eyes for what felt like only a moment before my alarm jolted me awake. It was time to go back. As I walked down the quiet hallway toward my patient's room, I instinctively glanced through the glass window. Inside, I saw David. He was wearing full protective gear, gown, gloves, N95 mask, and face shield, standing beside Pastor James's bed, checking his IV lines. His posture was calm, his movements steady. Not wanting to interrupt, I lifted a thumbs up to ask if everything was okay. David looked up and returned the gesture. A simple thumbs up. Satisfied, I nodded and walked toward the nurse's station. I pulled up the patient's chart on the computer to review his vitals, my mind still groggy from the short break. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned my head, and there was David, stepping out of a different patient's room. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. That wasn't possible. I had just seen him in Pastor James's room. He had looked right at me. He had given me a thumbs up. Yet here he was, coming from across the hall, looking completely normal, completely unaware. A cold chill ran down my spine. Swallowing hard, I turned to him and asked, "Were you just in my patient's room?" He frowned, looking confused. "No, I've been in room 14, helping another nurse with a cleanup." "Why?" My mouth went dry. I snapped my head back toward Pastor James's room. The room was empty, except for him, still unconscious, lying on the ventilator. No one else was inside. The figure I had seen, the one who had given me a thumbs up, was gone. I felt a sharp, electric sensation crawl down my spine, my body suddenly cold despite the stuffy warmth of the ICU. My mind raced for an explanation: fatigue, a trick of the dim hospital lighting, a hallucination from too much stress. But deep down, I knew someone had been in that room. And whoever or whatever it was, it had looked right at me. After that eerie night, things in the ICU continued as usual, if you could call death and chaos usual. We had no time to process what had happened, no room for superstition or fear. The only thing that mattered was keeping our patients alive. David, as always, was a rock for the rest of us. He never complained, never hesitated, and never put himself before his patients. But that night, something changed. He sat down beside me at the nurse's station, rubbing his temples after finishing a long round of hand washing. "I don't feel so good," he muttered. A quiet alarm went off in my head. I turned back to the computer and saw that Pastor James's COVID-19 test results had finally come back. Positive. I felt my stomach drop. David had been so close to him, performing CPR, pushing meds, adjusting his ventilator, and he had only been wearing a standard surgical mask. I turned to him, my chest tightening. "You need to get tested, right now, and if you don't feel okay, go home and rest." At first, David refused. He didn't want to leave us short-staffed. The ICU was drowning, and we all knew it. Every extra pair of hands mattered, but this wasn't a normal kind of exhaustion. I could see it in his face. His usual sharpness was gone, replaced by a glassy, feverish haze. After several of us begged him to take care of himself, he finally agreed. He clocked out and left the hospital. That was the last time we saw him standing on his own. 1 week later, David became our patient. When David was admitted to the ICU, it no longer felt real. We weren't just nurses anymore. We were his colleagues, his friends, his family. He arrived from the emergency department already on a ventilator in a deep coma. The virus had done what it did best. It had turned strong, healthy lungs into useless scar tissue. The moment we saw him, reality hit us like a freight train. The unit felt different. The same room where we had fought to save so many strangers now held one of our own. We knew his stats, we knew the prognosis, we knew what the survival rates were for patients who reached this stage, but we couldn't accept it. We had seen so many nameless faces pass through these doors, hooked up to the same machines, suffering the same fate. But this was David, the man who had spent his career saving others. The one who had stayed late, covered extra shifts, and jumped into resuscitations without hesitation. The lab results confirmed our worst fears. Blood clots filled his lungs. The virus had triggered severe clotting, making it nearly impossible for oxygen to reach his body. We administered powerful anticoagulants, trying to break up the clots, but it came with another deadly risk: severe internal bleeding. It was a cruel, unwinnable battle. We spent days fighting for him, adjusting his meds, flipping him onto his stomach to improve oxygenation, watching every number on the monitor as if our willpower alone could bring him back. But then his condition worsened. More blood clots appeared throughout his body. His lungs were failing beyond repair. Even a lung transplant was no longer an option. We knew what was coming. When the time arrived, we stood there in silence as David slipped away. There was nothing more we could do. The aftermath, a loss. We couldn't fill the ICU, felt emptier after he was gone. His absence was like a gaping wound, one that no amount of time or hard work could heal. We started a fundraiser for his family, trying to ease the financial burden left behind, but no amount of money could ever replace him. For 2 weeks after his passing, we took turns bringing dinner to his wife and kids, trying to offer them the same care and support that David had given to so many of us. But at night, when the hallways were quiet, I would pass by the ICU and half expect to see him standing there in full PPE, giving me a thumbs up. And even now, I still wonder, did he ever leave the ICU at all? After David's passing, the atmosphere in our ICU grew heavier than ever. We didn't just lose a coworker, we lost a brother, a friend, someone who had given everything for his patients, for us. And then fear crept in. If David, an experienced, dedicated, and strong ICU nurse, couldn't survive, what chance did the rest of us have? But there was no time to grieve. The virus didn't pause. The ICU remained full, but the number of nurses kept shrinking. Some quit, burned out beyond repair, others fell sick, some never came back. Living in constant fear. We did everything we could to protect our families. I remember those days vividly. After every shift, I wouldn't step inside my house right away. I had a bucket of soapy water waiting outside, stripping off my scrubs and scrubbing my skin raw before even thinking about entering. I slept in a separate room. I wore a mask at home. I avoided hugging my kids. I feared that a simple touch could steal the breath from the people I loved most. Looking back, maybe it was extreme. Maybe it was unnecessary. But at that time, we knew nothing. We were facing an invisible enemy, and we had no idea how to fight it. All we could do was try to keep our loved ones safe, even if it meant keeping our distance. And then Delta came. We thought we had seen the worst. We hadn't. When the Delta variant hit, it was a nightmare like nothing before. Hospitals overflowed. We ran out of beds, out of ventilators, out of hope. Patients were younger, sicker, and dying faster than ever before. The virus wasn't just taking the elderly anymore, it was attacking people in their 30s, 40s, even 20s. And we were running on empty. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was emotional, mental, and soul-crushing. We had already given everything, and yet it wasn't enough. Who will save the healers? Every day we showed up. We put on our masks, our gowns, our gloves. We held the hands of dying patients when their families weren't allowed to be there. We whispered words of comfort even when we knew they wouldn't make it. And we wondered who will take care of us, because one by one we were breaking, but we kept going, because that's what we do. If anyone thought the first wave of COVID-19 was horrific, they had never seen Delta. During the initial outbreak, patients would usually deteriorate over 1 to 2 weeks before losing their battle. It was agonizing, but at least we had time. Time to try every possible treatment, time to prepare families for the inevitable, time to process what was happening. Delta changed everything. This variant didn't wait. A person could walk into the hospital feeling unwell, and within days, sometimes mere hours, they would be gasping for breath, requiring a ventilator, and then gone. It was brutal, relentless, and indiscriminate. I had never seen so much death in my entire career. A hospital overflowing with death. The ICU was at its absolute limit. Every bed was occupied. Every patient was critically ill. They all had one thing in common: they couldn't breathe. Their lungs, once filled with air, were now stiff, drowning in inflammation and fluid. It was like watching someone slowly suffocate while we stood helplessly by. We maxed out every ventilator setting, higher oxygen levels, increased pressure, anything to force air into those failing lungs. But no matter what we did, it never seemed to be enough. People kept dying. I couldn't tell you the last time I saw a patient recover and leave the ICU alive. A hopeless choice. We faced an impossible, soul-crushing dilemma. If we intubated, the patient would almost certainly never come off the ventilator. The survival rate for intubated Delta patients was abysmal. Most never made it. If we didn't intubate, they would die from oxygen deprivation. So we were forced to choose between two deaths: the slow agony of suffocation, or the inevitable decline of a ventilated body shutting down organ by organ. And every single day we had to witness the outcome of that choice. I would start my shift with a full unit. By the end of it, multiple beds would be empty, not because patients had recovered, but because they had died. And those empty beds? They never stayed empty for long. A new patient, gasping for air, eyes wide with fear, would be rushed in before we even had time to process the loss of the last. I remember standing at a bedside adjusting a ventilator for a dying man and realizing I had done the exact same thing in that exact same spot, just 24 hours earlier. Different patient, same outcome. A level of suffering no one could understand. No one outside those hospital walls could ever truly understand what we endured. We weren't just fighting a virus. We were fighting against time, against science, against the limits of medicine itself. And we were losing. At some point, we stopped hoping. We stopped wondering if a patient would make it out alive. Instead, we wondered how long they would last before we had to zip them into a body bag. That was the darkest truth of Delta. It wasn't just a surge in cases. It was a surge in death, a tsunami of loss that drowned every bit of hope we had left. In the midst of the Delta wave's merciless devastation, where death became routine and despair was our daily companion, one patient stood out. He wasn't elderly. He wasn't frail. He wasn't someone we expected to see fighting for his life in the ICU. He was 38 years old. For the sake of privacy, I'll call him Josh. The fear in his eyes, Josh arrived in the ICU struggling for air, his chest rising and falling in panicked gasps. He was placed on a BiPAP machine, a high-pressure oxygen mask meant to force air into his failing lungs, the last step before a ventilator. Even through the plastic mask, I could see the fear in his eyes. He tried to speak, but every word stole the oxygen he so desperately needed. I knelt beside his bed, gripping his hand gently. "Josh, I'm here to help you, but I need you to stay calm. I don't want to put you on a ventilator. You have to breathe slowly. You can get through this." He nodded, his eyes pleading for reassurance. I wanted to believe it. I really did. A wife's desperation, Josh fought hard. He listened to my instructions, inhaling as deeply as he could, clinging to life with sheer willpower. But every time his wife called, he pushed himself to speak, and every sentence sent his oxygen levels plummeting. I had to make an impossible request. I called his wife and said as gently as I could, Please, don't call too often. Right now, he needs to focus on breathing. It's the only thing keeping him from the ventilator." Her response stunned me. "I know what you're doing. You people are trying to kill my husband." The words hit like a gut punch. But I didn't blame her. She was terrified. She was watching her husband drown in plain sight, and there was nothing she could do. The fear, the helplessness, it wasn't just ours. Their family suffered with us, but despite everything, Josh kept fighting, the moment we feared. Then, just like every other Delta patient, his condition turned suddenly and violently. One moment he was holding on, the next his oxygen levels plummeted into the danger zone. It was happening. The decision we had fought so hard to avoid was now unavoidable. The doctor looked at me and nodded. "We have to intubate." We prepared the medications, sedatives to put him into a coma, paralytics to suppress the violent gasps his body would soon make. I leaned in close, brushing his hair back gently. "Josh, we're going to help you breathe now. This will let your body rest, okay?" His eyes widened with raw, primal fear. He knew what it meant. Patients who went on ventilators during Delta didn't come off. As the sedative took hold, tears slid down his face. I squeezed his hand one last time before it went limp, and then he was gone. Not dead, but lost in the endless, silent sleep of the ventilator. A familiar story, an unwritten ending. I don't know what happened to Josh. I left at the end of my shift knowing that by the time I came back, his bed could be empty. I wanted to believe he survived. I wanted to believe he defied the odds. But deep down, I knew. Josh wasn't just one patient. He was every patient. His story wasn't unique. It was the story of the Delta wave itself. Young, strong, healthy. Until they weren't. Until they too became another empty bed in the ICU. After Josh was placed on the ventilator, I braced myself for the inevitable. I had seen this story unfold too many times before. Not a single Delta patient who had required intubation had survived under my watch. Not one. I told myself not to hope. I told myself not to get attached. I told myself that by the time I came back for my next shift, his bed would be empty. But Josh was different. An impossible recovery. Against every odd, Josh's body began to fight back. It started small. Tiny victories. We were able to gradually decrease the ventilator settings, just a fraction lower at first, then a little more. His oxygen levels held steady. His vitals didn't crash. Day by day, he improved. For the first time in months, I watched a patient climb back from the edge. I barely recognized the feeling. It was hope. The price of survival. But Delta never let anyone go unscathed. 4 days after we removed the ventilator, a new complication emerged. Josh's right hand started turning purple. His fingers felt ice cold. We ordered an ultrasound. The results confirmed what we already feared. A large blood clot had formed in his hand, cutting off circulation. We immediately started aggressive anticoagulants, trying to break up the clot before it spread. But we were too late. By the next morning, his index and middle fingers had turned completely black. Dead tissue. There was no saving them. I had to be the one to tell him. When I walked into his room, he was awake, alert, breathing on his own, a miracle in itself. I sat beside him, placing my hand gently over his uninjured one. "Josh, you made it. You survived." His eyes filled with gratitude, then flickered with concern. "But," he rasped. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "There's been a complication. The lack of circulation caused severe damage to your fingers, and we can't save them. You're going to lose them." Josh stared at me, then at his hand. For a long moment, he was silent. Then he did something I never expected. He laughed, not a bitter laugh, not an angry one, a relieved laugh. "I can live without 2 fingers, he finally said. "I thought I wasn't going to live at all." And just like that, I knew Josh wasn't just a survivor. He was a fighter. The only one who walked away days later, Josh became the first Delta patient I ever saw leave the ICU alive. He was the only one. Every other patient either died while intubated or was extubated only to pass away shortly after. Every single one. Delta didn't just kill, it slaughtered. It didn't just take lives, it ripped them away, brutally and without mercy. But Josh made it. He walked out of that unit missing 2 fingers, but with a beating heart and working lungs. In a time where all we knew was death, loss, and despair, he proved that survival was still possible. And for the first time in a long, long time, I allowed myself to believe. Maybe not every battle was lost. After the Delta wave, after the endless deaths, after fighting a war we were never equipped to win, I left nursing. Not because I stopped caring, not because I wanted to, but because the weight of what I had seen broke me. I had spent too many nights haunted by the memories of those we couldn't save. Too many shifts watching patients gasp for air, knowing nothing I did would be enough. Too many moments standing over the bodies of colleagues I once laughed with. It wasn't just exhaustion. It wasn't just burnout. It was grief. A deep, unshakable grief that medicine had no cure for. We didn't just lose patients. We lost ourselves. I wasn't alone. So many of us walked away. Some quit. Some turned to therapy. Some never found a way to cope at all. We had spent months pouring every ounce of our souls into keeping others alive. But when the pandemic was finally over, the world moved on and left us behind. The worst wound came after the war. At the height of the pandemic, we were called heroes. People clapped for us, donated food to hospitals, thanked us in the streets. Then, almost overnight, the gratitude disappeared. If I wore a mask in public, people shot me annoyed glances. If I spoke about what I had lived through, some dismissed me, saying I was exaggerating or lying. It was as if the world wanted to forget. And we, the ones who had fought on the front lines, were a reminder of something no one wanted to remember. But we haven't forgotten. We still remember the friends we lost. We still remember the patients who never went home. We still carry the nightmares, the guilt, the what-ifs. If you know a nurse, check on them. Not all scars are visible. If you know someone who worked in healthcare during the pandemic, ask them if they're okay. If they talk, listen. If they cry, let them. And if you ever cross paths with a nurse, doctor, or healthcare worker, be kind. Because I promise you, they are carrying wounds you will never see. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time to hear our story. I hope you have a good day, or at the very least, a peaceful night. Leaving the ICU wasn't just about walking away from a job. It was about walking away from a version of myself that no longer existed. The pandemic changed us. It took something from all of us, whether we realize it or not. Some lost loved ones, some lost time, some lost faith in the world, and some of us lost ourselves. I don't know if I'll ever go back to nursing, maybe one day, or maybe that chapter of my life is closed for good. But what I do know is this: the world may have moved on, but we still remember. We remember the chaos, the fear, the exhaustion. We remember the faces of those we couldn't save. We remember what it felt like to hold someone's hand as they took their last breath, knowing their family wasn't allowed to be there. And if you've read this far, if you've taken the time to listen, thank you, because our stories deserve to be heard.